Hi everybody, it's Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au. I want to highlight for you just how unreliable price growth data is, the stuff that's published in media all the time, particularly figures from one particular source. And there's some figures out today talking about what allegedly happened with house prices and unit prices in the major city markets in the month of July. And these things are always reported by media as an absolute fact, with all sorts of enormous conclusions drawn from what this data purports to show is going on in our major markets. I just want to show you, illustrate for you by comparing price growth data from a number of different sources, just how many discrepancies are and how totally unreliable these figures are. And with the conclusion that I draw pretty constantly is that it's all dodgy data to some extent or other. Now, to give you an example, how much do you think Canberra house prices have risen in the past month? Well, if we believe CoreLogic in the latest figures, Canberra house prices are up about 3.5% in annual terms. The figures from Domain, which is another very major and supposedly credible source of price data, the Canberra house price is up 6.2%, so almost double what CoreLogic says. But then SQM Research, which is another reputable source, frequently puts out data on what's happening with prices and rentals, their figure is 12%. So we have three different figures from three major sources on the same market, Canberra house prices. CoreLogic says 3%, Domain says 6%, and SQM Research says 12%. So there's a range from 3% growth to 12%. The bottom end of that range suggests a very moderate market, while the top end of that range from SQM Research suggests the market is booming. So what about Melbourne apartments? Well, according to Domain, in the last 12 months, the median price for apartments in Melbourne is up just 1%. But CoreLogic says it's up 3.5%. And SQM Research comes along and says it's up 9%. So again, you've got this vast discrepancy. A couple of figures saying very, very moderate market, not much growth happening in the Melbourne apartment market. But then another source comes along and suggests it's almost 10% growth in annual terms. But the biggest discrepancy I've seen recently relates to the Hobart market. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll know that Hobart is currently the strongest of the capital city markets in a number of ways, including the price growth. It's the only capital city market, according to most research sources anyway, that's currently getting double-digit growth in house prices. But its apartment market is also going well, maybe not, because the three sources I've mentioned have all recently published figures on what's happening with apartment prices in the booming Hobart market. SQM says actually that prices for Hobart apartments have actually dropped in the last 12 months by about 1.5%. But CoreLogic says they've risen by 7%. And Domain says that Hobart apartment prices have risen 23% in the last 12 months. So we're all talking about exactly the same market, the Hobart apartment market, where one source says prices have dropped, another source says they've risen 7%, and another major big name source says they're up 23%. How do you make sense of that? Well, you can't. Neither can I. I've got no idea what's going on from those figures. But that's why at Hotspotting we tend to focus more on what's happening with sales volumes and with prices, because the price data is all over the place. These kinds of discrepancies are actually common. They're never highlighted in mainstream media. They should be, because people need to be aware that the figure that's published today isn't a fact. It's just one picture of a market from one entity, and another major entity can come along next week with figures that show a completely different picture. But the one thing there's no doubt about is just how many properties are selling, how many houses are selling, how many apartments are selling in these markets. And that gives us a real pattern about what's happening and a true indication of where markets are heading. So we focus on that, and we've published the latest analysis in the new winter edition of the Price Predict Index, which is now available on the Hotspotting website. But just think it's important that everyone is aware about the price data. It's all rubbery figures. It's all dodgy data to a certain extent. They all have different methodologies. They all claim their methodology is the best, but the outcome for real estate consumers is confusion and misinformation. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au signing off. I will talk to you again soon.